welcome everyone. Welcome to our third webinar in our series Between the Lines with NCMC, NCMC standing for Negotiation and Conflict Management Collaborative, the center or the initiative at INSEAD, which aims to create, disseminate the best evidence-based negotiation and conflict management knowledge that we saw in academia. So today we have the pleasure, the honor actually of hosting Professor Charles Kupchan. He's a professor of international affairs from Georgetown University and a senior fellow, and a senior fellow on the Council of Foreign Relations. Today he's going to be talking about his book, Turning Enemies into Friends, How Peace Breaks Out, a book that I loved reading and influenced a lot of my thought. And I thought, why not, instead of me talking about it, have the person who wrote the book address you. So a few house rules before we go forward. You as the audience, you're muted and your video is off for focus because there are way too many people. The session is being recorded. So Miraflor, if we haven't started yet, this is a great moment for us to start. The chat box is only for host posting. So us at leading the webinar here. Actually, at the end of this webinar, we're going to post a lot of useful information and links for you related to this session and more. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A tab. And if you don't have questions, but you would like to help us choose which questions to answer first, because sometimes we might have too many questions and not be able to answer them all, please, there is usually a place there for you to upvote. So vote on the questions you like most so that we can then select the ones that got the most votes and make sure those are the priority. And then the recording will be made available at a later date with the consent of Charles here. So thank you, Charles, for agreeing to that. So without further ado, and so that we can give most of our time to what matters, Professor Kupchan, Charles, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Horacio, and thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to have a conversation with your group today. I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., which, as you can imagine, is a bit of a disorienting place to be right now. A lot of unemployed neighbors, former federal officials, and given the scenario, the setting, the backdrop of our conversation today, it is admittedly a bit of an odd time to be talking about peace breaking out and how enemies become friends, because in some respects we've gone from a post-war era, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, to a pre-war era, and maybe even we could call this a war era, because we've got major conflicts going on in Ukraine, in Sudan, in the Middle East. U.S.-China tensions are heating up. A trade war seems to be breaking out, and so things are shall we say, a little bit disorienting today. But in some ways, it makes it even more important to have a conversation about peacemaking and stable peace as we look at the prospects of a more dangerous and a more conflictual world. So I want to really kind of say that in the Q&A, we can talk about where we are today. We can talk about Ukraine. We can talk about Trump's latest peace proposal, if you want to call it a peace proposal. But for now, I want to kind of set that aside and address the question of where does stable peace come from? Where does warm peace come from? And it's quite interesting that when I set out to write this book and began to examine the existing literature, there really wasn't much literature. There's a literature on conflict resolution, there's a literature on negotiation, there's a massive literature on war and conflict, but there isn't a big literature on deep and stable peace. And I think the answer to why that is the case is that when peace breaks out, nothing happens. And as a consequence, the journalists aren't rushing to cover it. Academics aren't saying, oh, there's noise, there's fighting, there's war, we better go figure out what's going on. When peace breaks out, nothing happens. And as a consequence, sometimes I think we overlook just how magical, how revolutionary, how profound that process is. If you drive today from the United States to Canada, you get to a border, but you don't find any troops. You don't find any tanks. You don't find any soldiers. Given Trump and where we are right now, maybe in a few months you will. I hope not. But that border is a revolutionary accomplishment. The same, you drive today from France to Germany. You might see some sheep, but you're not going to see a tank. You're not going to see a border guard. You don't have to change money, right? And this is a border on which untold numbers of people have been killed. And all of a sudden, that border has become geopolitically inconsequential. So we know that peace breaks out. We know that geopolitical competition is escapable, even though we live in a dangerous and conflictual world. And it's that puzzle that I want to talk about for the next 20 minutes or so. How does that happen? How do you get to situations in which countries that spent centuries killing each other are now warm friends? So warm that the mere concept of war between them becomes unthinkable. In laying out the kind of intellectual landscape for this phenomenon, the phenomenon of stable peace, I identified 3 different kinds of stable peace that fall along a continuum. The first and the least mature form is what I call rapprochement, and that's when 2 adversaries stand down. They don't necessarily fashion a new order, a set of rules for governing their relations, but they call it quits. The second, more mature form is a security community in which there is an order, in which there is a sense of common identity, in which there is a kind of beginning sense of the unthinkability of war. And then the third and the most mature form of stable peace is a union, where the former adversaries have become so comfortable with each other that they merge into a new single political entity. And in the case of, let's say, the United States, we are now a stable peace that takes the form of a union. And that's relatively new. People think about the United States as having been formed in 1776 or 1789 when the federal Constitution was ratified, but it took a very long time for the United States of 13 colonies to turn into a real federal entity in which Americans felt more loyal to the Union than they did to their states. And for most of the 19th century, our wars were fought by the independent militias of the separate states. The United States fell apart in civil war in the 1860s. And it really wasn't until the late 19th century that anybody ever put a singular verb after the term United States. It was always the United States are. Now it's the United States is, because people have a sense that we are in this together, and we are Americans before we are Virginians, with perhaps the exception of Texas, where they still think about themselves as Texans first and Americans second, but that's the exception and not the rule. Europe, I would say, is more of a security community than it is a union, or perhaps it's something in between. It's a confederal, not a federal entity, where some competence, such as trade, has passed up to the supranational level, Other competences remain at the national level, but it nonetheless constitutes stable peace because war among the members of the European Union has become unthinkable. So that's the kind of anatomy of stable peace. Now I want to talk a little bit about how it happens and when it happens. What's the process through which peace breaks out? And I'm going to use one example of the 20 that I have in the book to just put a little bit of flesh on the bones as I talk about the process, the stages through which stable peace occurs. And that example is going to be the United States and the United Kingdom, which were for really about 100+ years each other's main enemies, right? The United States and Britain went to war in the Revolutionary era. The United States and Britain went to war in 1812, and they remained bitter enemies until really the end of the 19th century. Today, we think about the US and Britain as in a special relationship, cousins, if you will, part of the same family. That really didn't happen until the 20th century. And so I want to focus on that critical period in the late 19th century when the two countries went from being enemies to friends. The story starts in 1895 when a border dispute breaks out between British Guiana and Venezuela. And the United States, which is getting a little bit uppity during this time because of rapid economic growth after the end of the Civil War, issues a message to the British that says, this dispute is occurring in the Western Hemisphere. According to the Monroe Doctrine, which gives the United States a droit de regard, a sphere of influence over the Western Hemisphere, we hereby request that you take this dispute to neutral arbitration. And the British respond, get lost. Get out of here. Who do you think you are? And the United States responds by beginning to talk about war. And in fact, the US government orders the Navy to mobilize. And there is talk of war in Congress. This message gets passed back to London. London pulls the cabinet together, and the cabinet decides that they can't handle a war with the United States. The Admiralty, the British Navy, is overstretched. You're seeing unrest in South Africa. The Boer War is emerging. You've got rapid modernization and industrialization in Germany, in Japan. And so the Admiralty says to the cabinet, can't do this. So what happens? Britain sends back a message to the United States in which it says, we hear you. We recognize the Monroe Doctrine. We will take this dispute to neutral arbitration. And the United States goes, wow, what just happened? And what just happened is stage one of peace breaking out. And that is the British sent an unambiguous message of benign intent, an unambiguous message that they wanted to back down from intractable rivalry. And it was so loud and so unmistakable that the United States heard it, interpreted it correctly, and said, something interesting is going on here. And that begins stage two. Stage one is unilateral accommodation. One party sends a message to the other by backing down, by withholding power, by making a concession. It says, we want to change the nature of our relationship with you. And it's costly and it's unambiguous. Because if it's not costly and unambiguous, the other side probably won't hear it, won't see it, won't interpret it correctly. So stage two is when these two countries that are still suspicious of each other start trading concessions. And what you see between 1895 and roughly 1900 is a series of mutual concessions, reciprocal restraint being exercised by both London and Washington on a whole host of issues, including fishing rights, the border between the United States and Canada, border issues out west, Oregon, Washington, Vancouver, all kinds of disputes that had been festering for a long time begin to be settled because the United States and the United Kingdom are beginning to see each other not as adversaries, but as potential friends. That's stage 2, mutual accommodation. Stage 3 is really the beginning of the move from high politics to low politics. This initial trading of concessions, these feelers, usually occur behind closed doors because it's dangerous politically to make peace with your enemy. There's always somebody waiting there in the wings politically to say traitor, treason, appeaser. And so usually these initial steps are taken quietly and behind closed doors. And then as momentum builds, you get your societies to buy in. And so during this third phase, you see various kinds of efforts by elites to build domestic support. You see the US-UK Chamber of Commerce founded. And at the beginning of the dinners that they held, they would sing the Star-Spangled Banner and God Save the Queen. They would put the British flag and the American flag behind them. You saw new shipping lines. You saw new theaters, new plays, new books, all about UK, US, Anglo-Saxon harmony. That's stage 3, when high politics and low politics merge and you get societal integration, because that societal buy-in is important to make this lasting, to make it stable. And then the final stage of building stable peace, the capstone, if you will, is the change of narrative and the change of identity. And what happened here is that Americans and Brits began to speak about each other in different ways. The American president and the British prime minister began to say, war between the United States and the UK would be a civil war. It would be fratricide. It becomes unthinkable. And that change of identity in which the other becomes in part the us is what makes that stable peace so durable. And it, in many respects, congeals, gives durability to that process of rapprochement that began in that critical period of 1895 to 1896. And interestingly enough, if you look at British war plans, right, the British sized their navy according to the two-power standard, which is that the Royal Navy would be larger than the next two most powerful navies combined. What happened? The United States got taken off that list. It was no longer considered a potential adversary. 1906, the last contingent of British military forces is withdrawn from Canada. And the United States, not long thereafter, basically burns its war plans for a US-UK conflict. And that's really the end of the story. That led to US-UK rapprochement. That rapprochement built over time and it turned into something that I would say is much more of a security community. And the so-called special relationship has lasted to this day. So that's a quick summary of how this process works: unilateral concessions, reciprocal restraint, societal integration, and then finally the generation of new narratives. Let me just take a quick second to talk a little bit about when does this happen? What are some of the ingredients that allow this to happen? And then I'm going to sum up with a few takeaways and look forward to the conversation with all of you. In terms of when and how this happens, clearly the ability to withhold power is important, the ability to exercise restraint. That's what creates the breathing room. One power steps back, the other power steps back. And it's that signaling of the willingness to accommodate, the willingness to make concessions in the service of sending signals of benign intent that is so critical here. And importantly, it is not only democracies that are able to do this. One of the most important takeaways that I found from this research is that democracies can do this, autocracies can do it with autocracies, democracies can do it with autocracies. I think we overrate the importance of regime type. And we sometimes overlook the ability of countries that do not have constitutional checks and balances to nonetheless practice this kind of restraint. Brazil and Argentina really embarked on the path of stable peace at a time when they were both run by military governments. The Soviet Union and China in the 1950s built a remarkably close relationship. In the UAE, Abu Dhabi and Dubai began to embark upon this process through the practice of mutual restraint. And there was no history of liberal democracy, no history of checks and balances, but they relied upon tribal traditions and tribal decision-making procedures to give each other some breathing room and to build the kind of shared trust that leads to the ability of these different parties to step back and to call it quits. Another important takeaway, it's the politics stupid, it's not the economy stupid. You know, I think there's a view out there, particularly in field of international relations, that economic interdependence is what brings parties together. I did not find that. That economic integration seals the deal, but in the absence of geopolitical and political rapprochement and standing down, economic interdependence, trade and commerce will not do the trick. We see today Japan and China deeply integrated, but the politics and the geopolitics are wrong. The international community has invested, I don't know how many millions of dollars in getting Israelis and Palestinians to do joint ventures together. Has it produced stable peace? No. Look at the Balkans. Investments in getting Republika Srpska and Bosnia, Croatia, you know, everybody's invested. Has it brought the parties together? No. And that's because the politics and the geopolitics aren't there. So economic integration, commercial integration can seal the deal. But if you don't get the politics and the geopolitics right, you're not going to get across the finish line. A third important takeaway. I looked at a lot of cases where countries start down this road and it fails. And it usually fails at that stage between reciprocal restraint and societal integration. It gets blocked domestically. So, for example, the United Arab Republic, Egypt merging with Syria, didn't last very long. Why? Because Egypt tried to nationalize the Syrian economy. They displaced the Syrian elite, the bazaar merchants, the military leadership, and they revolted. And they blew up the United Arab Republic. Senegal and Gambia merge. They embark on a union. What happens? Senegal, French-speaking majority. The Gambian English-speaking elite were dispossessed by the merger of these two countries, and they revolted. And as a consequence, the Senegambian Federation died. The Soviet Union and China in the 1950s. It looked like peace was breaking out. But what happened? The Soviet Union sort of industrialized, wanted to get a level of geopolitical quiescence, Mao, peasant revolution, continuous socialist change, they had very different social orders. And it was about this question of continuous revolution versus investing in the status quo that pushed Beijing and Moscow apart. So they got the initial concessions, the trading, the coming together, the high politics right, but when it came to low politics, their social orders were incompatible, and the Soviet Union and China became rivals by the end of the 1950s and were essentially, in many respects, enemies until the more recent rapprochement that we've seen between Beijing and Moscow. A final takeaway is that culture matters, that in many of the cases I looked at, there was some raw material, some process of natural self-selection that helped these parties come together. So in the US and the UK, a sense of common Anglo-Saxon ethnicity, race, religion. In the case of the UAE, right? Common language, common ethnic background. It's easier to bring parties together when there is some sense of natural affinity. It's harder to do when that sense of natural affinity is elusive. But importantly, this sense of affinity is very much a product of social and political construction, right? France and Germany used to be each other's main others. Now they have a sense of a common European identity. And it's important to recognize that this process can go in reverse, right? Identities are easily manipulated by elites who deem it in their interests to do so, right? If you went back to, let's say, Sarajevo during the heyday of Yugoslavia, Bosnian Muslims lived next to Bosnian Serbs who lived next door to Bosnian Croats, and one was Muslim and one was Orthodox and one was Catholic, and nobody cared. They may have known that their neighbor was of a different religion, but they didn't care. And that's because they had a broader identity as Yugoslavs or as Bosnians. And then Milosevic and Tudjman and Karadzic and others come along, and what do? They manipulate identities so that your Serb neighbor becomes your enemy rather than your neighbor. And Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore. So this is not a process that is unidirectional. That is to say, once you build stable peace, you can go to the bar and have a drink because we're done. It requires care and feeding. It requires sustainment. Look at what happened to the UK. The UK has engaged in one of the most stunning acts of self-harm of late by leaving the European Union. And why did that happen? In many respects, the manipulation of identity and the degree to which there was a sense that somehow the UK, its autonomy, its independence would be better off if it broke with the common European enterprise. So that's all to say that stable peace is possible, does happen, but it requires care and feeding. It requires constant oxygen. It is not durable to the point of being irreversible. And that leads me to my final comment. You know, we are now at a moment of history in which a lot of things that we have taken for granted are up for grabs, right? I would just remind everyone about what happened in late 2024 and 2025 and the gravity of our moment. Donald Trump gets reelected in the United States despite having tried to overturn American democracy and been convicted on 34 felony counts. Then the French government falls. Then the German government falls. Then there's an election in Romania in which a far-right figure is the number one vote getter, he's disallowed by the courts because he's too far to the right. Then the South Korean government declares martial law and the leader gets impeached. Then the Canadian government collapses. Now Donald Trump is in office, and we just don't know whether the West is going to hang together. So this is a moment in which the stable peace that liberal democracies built after World War II is up for grabs. We don't know that it will survive the Trump era. My hope, my prayer is that it will, but I think we all need to keep in mind that stable peace is attainable, magical, revolutionary, but fragile. And as a consequence, we need to ensure that we give it the appropriate care and feeding that it needs to ensure that when peace breaks out, it lasts. Horacio, I'm going to stop there.
You're on mute.
We can't hear you.
Yes, I realized that
Okay.
as I was speaking. Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Charles. Indeed, like very powerful ideas. It's interesting that the lecture we had, the webinar we had about a month ago with Professor Chris Blattman, he was talking about why we fight, right? And now we're talking about how we become friends. And in both cases, showing that there is a delicate element there that we really need to be thinking about peace for in a much more serious manner, and really about peace as this more fragile element that we need to cater for. And one of the things that I used to say in class before I jump into the questions very quickly is that, for example, the European Union, it started as a dream for political unification, but after a while, a lot of the arguments against it were economic arguments, and somewhat the peace thing got taken for granted. And I think that resonates a bit with what I heard you say now at the very end. So it's interesting to see that indeed, after a while, one of the things that I see happens when peace breaks out is that people start taking it for granted and then start focusing on the other priorities, and then not putting as much attention and effort for peace to continue. And that might have been part of the eroding exercise that brought us to where we are today. So hopefully not. Hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully it will stay as you well said. So we have a couple questions already, quite interesting. I'll start with those. For everyone else who's listening to us, I would invite you to please write down your questions. And for those who don't want to ask a question, feel free to upvote the ones you like the most, so we make sure we get those answered out. So let me get to the one that has the most votes so far. So why suddenly, after Trump took office, the USA behaves as no longer a partner to Europe, but like a best friend to Putin? And that's getting a lot of quick votes right now. So, but I already said, yeah, go for it.
I think that understanding where Trump comes from and what Trump represents requires understanding the evolution of American politics over the last couple of decades. And I think there are two big features that explain the Trump phenomenon. One is that there has been a hollowing out of the American middle class that has been driven principally by automation and the digital revolution. And for the lion's share of American workers, particularly American workers without a college education, the quality of life has been on a steady decline for several decades. And many of those workers feel dispossessed, looked down upon, left behind by globalization and by the elite structures that have managed globalization. And the other phenomenon is that this sense of dislocation at home has been accompanied by a series of American actions abroad, which I think have increased the disaffection or the distrust that many American voters feel for the U.S. government. And in particular, I'm talking about what we call the forever wars, in which, you know, the United States after 9/11 tried, to put it euphemistically, to turn Iraq and Afghanistan into Ohio. And it didn't go very well, and it cost $6 trillion. And now the Taliban is in control of Afghanistan. And so Trump was, in many respects, the product of this primal scream in the American electorate. Too much world, not enough America. Stop this train. I want to get off it. And Trump is an odd person to represent that America First movement because he grew up with a golden spoon in his mouth, and he comes from the very elite that many Americans are angry about, but he has been able to tap into that grievance because he is a very astute politician. He knows how to appeal to that sense of grievance and communicate to many Americans that he's their guy and that he has their back. I don't think he does. I think his tariffs are going to make the quality of life for Americans much worse, not much better. But that's Trump, and he thinks he has a mandate to disrupt and overturn the status quo, and that's what he's doing. Where does the affection for Putin come from? Why does he have this inclination to disregard democratic allies and cozy up to autocrats? I don't know. I mean, my best guess is that he's envious, that Trump has autocratic instincts. We are seeing them play out in American politics today, and he likes the strongman style of governance. And that draws him toward Putin. It draws him toward Xi Jinping. And importantly, I don't think Trump is a terribly ideological person, but his movement is ideological. His movement is led in many respects by J.D. Vance, and it's very conservative. It is about the West as a land of Christendom, of anti-woke values. And as a consequence, there's this view in the movement, the America First movement, that the United States should ally itself with people like Putin, Meloni, Viktor Orban, Marine Le Pen, and others who share this somewhat reactionary sense of the decline of the West and the need to kind of rebuild a Western civilization infused with Christian values and conservative identity.
Super. Well, thank you. This I did not think about the envy angle, but once you explained it to me, it really opened a couple windows in my mind at the very least. So I'll move on to the next question. Since you mentioned just the role of elites a bit there in your talk and now in answering this question, so can you please expand on the role of elites? Sometimes they seem to defend the status quo. In other cases, they look to pursue a new order. Any ideas on that?
Yeah, I mean, in all of the cases that I looked at, the initial move towards stable peace comes out of strategic necessity, right? It's not an act of altruism. Why did the British practice appeasement with the United States in the 1890s? It's because the Royal Navy said to them, we can't go to war. We don't have the ships to go to war with the United States. Why did Indonesia begin to back away from confrontasi with Malaysia, pursue rapprochement, and then help anchor the formation of ASEAN? Because the country was under biting international sanctions. And as a consequence, it needed a way to restore the economy and get out from under the pressure that was being applied by the international community. So in all of these cases, the elite community is looking for a way out of some problem. They want to lower the temperature. And as a consequence, they look for opportunities to make peace with their main enemy. And as I said, it often doesn't work. either because the other party doesn't respond, or more frequently, because of domestic resistance. I mean, look at Barack Obama, right? He tried to pull this off with Russia, with Myanmar, with Iran, with Cuba. And what did Republicans call him during his presidency? The appeaser-in-chief. Not the commander-in-chief, the appeaser-in-chief. And that's because there's a strong constituency in the United States, particularly in Florida, that does not want peace with Cuba, right? That wants to make sure that we continue to strangle Cuba, even if it doesn't make sense strategically or geopolitically, it pays dividends politically. And so elites are always in this sort of two-level game. They may be trying to make peace with an adversary outside their country, but they've got opponents inside their country that are trying to prevent this process of rapprochement from happening. One final thought on this front. This is harder to do today than it was earlier because nothing stays quiet, right? And oftentimes you want these initial processes of rapprochement to be behind closed doors because it's safer politically. But we now live in a world in which everything gets tweeted within 16 minutes. And so if the United States is having backdoor conversations with the Iranian regime about a new JCPOA, we're going to hear about it. And the domestic politics of peacemaking have become more difficult in a world in which it's extremely difficult to prevent leaks and to prevent back channel quiet conversations from becoming public conversations.
Thank you. Given the huge amount of questions, I'm just going to keep on throwing them at you as they come. And I'm refreshing here for the upvotes for the participants. So please remember to upvote on the questions you like most. So the next one I have here, as I just refresh, is, so how can the world avoid that the current war on tariffs leads to a military conflict? We should bear in mind that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941 because, among other things, the USA imposed an oil embargo on Japan. So that's the question. So
yeah, it's a great question, and you've kind of put your finger on the dual-faced nature of economic interdependence. Because, you know, the prevailing wisdom out there is that interdependence is good. Interdependence breeds stability. And in many respects, it does, right? If you were to say right now, what is the main check on Trump's tariff policy toward China? The answer is Wall Street and Walmart, right? Because they're picking up the phone and they're calling the White House and they're saying, what in God's good name are you doing? The stock market has crashed, the bond market has crashed, and if we don't get these tariffs down by July, the average cost of the average good at Walmart will be 30% higher, and the American public will be in revolt. And so there you see economic interdependence working to the advantage of trying to avoid a trade war. Now, whether it works or not, we don't know. We'll have to see how this plays out. But the flip side of that economic interdependence is, as you just pointed out with your example of Japan, interdependence amid tension is vulnerability. It's not a sense of mutual gain. And so what happened in the 30s is that the Japanese wanted to take over China and expand further, and they were using up all their oil, all their petroleum, all their goods, but they were heavily dependent upon the United States and Britain for imports of steel and oil to keep their war machine going. So that economic interdependence was a source of vulnerability, and they said, we need autarky. How are we going to get autarky? We're going to bomb Pearl Harbor and then take over all the oil and minerals in Southeast Asia. Didn't go so well. It was not a wise move for the Japanese to attack a country whose GDP was about 13 times larger than that of Japan. In general, you don't want to do that. And so what I'm saying here is that, you know, yes, economic interdependence keeps us together, but no, under the different circumstances, that interdependence is a source of vulnerability. And that's one of the reasons that we're seeing supply chains be moved out of China and what we call friendshored. Supply chains, particularly on high tech, on pharmaceuticals, on raw minerals, for example, raw earth minerals. We want them in places that we feel we can get them when the chips are down. So bottom line right now is that this could be 1930 all over again. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, the United States blowing up the global economy, economic nationalism, geopolitical tension, world war. Or we could be in the early stages of Trump's effort to negotiate a better deal with China. We get that deal, tariffs come down, and global economic fragmentation does not happen. We don't know which of those two visions will unfold.
Wish we knew. So going on to the next one, what is the most important thing the European Union should do to improve the status quo and avoid that right-wing politics destroys what has been achieved?
You know, as I said earlier on, Trump is not alone, right? Trump is a symptom of a broader political dysfunction in many democracies. And as a consequence, I think we need to sort of address the underlying problems and not see this as just Trump. And I do think that this really is about the digital revolution and the socioeconomic dislocation that is occurring really across the world, but it's hitting the hardest in those countries that led the industrial era. You know, and I think it's safe to say that here in the United States, and I think it's true in many European countries, the social contract of the industrial era is dead. And a lot of workers are just feeling that their future is bleak. And I'll just offer one quick data point. During the heyday of the industrial era, the largest employer in the United States was General Motors. If you had a job on a General Motors production line building cars, you made on average $35 an hour in today's dollars. Today, the largest employer in the United States is Walmart. Before the pandemic, the average wage of a Walmart worker was around $9 an hour. Today, I think it's probably up to 13 or 14. But that gives you some sense of the earning power of the sort of average American. And it's important to keep in mind that 42% of the American electorate is still white without a college education. That's Trump's base. Europe was a little bit behind the United States, but it's catching up. And for me, one of the $6 million questions is, will the center hold in France and in Germany? The answer so far is yes, the center's holding, but the center is shrinking, right? It may be that the next president of France hails from the National Rally Party. It may be that in Germany, Social Democrats and Christian Democrats keep losing market share to the left and to the right. That's the fundamental problem that we need to address. And I'll end my answer with one warning. The answer that Democrats and Republicans alike have to this problem is illusory. because their answer is, we're going to use tariffs and industrial policy to rebuild our manufacturing sector, and we're going to get you your job back on the GM production line. Ain't going to happen, right? Our workforces have moved largely from the manufacturing sector to the service sector, and that's not going to change. And so rather than promising our publics that we're going to get them their old jobs back, we need to start thinking about how to train our publics for the jobs of the future, how to educate them for the jobs of the future. And I think we got to look forward. We got to plan for a digital economy and not pine for an industrial economy that simply is gone for good.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more, so I'll try to get them in quick. So the next one in, again, just doing a quick update, is if you were to advise Ukraine now, what would you recommend them to do to stop the war and protect the country durably?
I think that that Trump is doing the right thing by trying to end the war and by talking to Putin. I wish that this had happened earlier under the Biden administration, because I think the Biden people would have handled it more effectively and would have been wiser in how they attempted to negotiate peace. Because the way Trump is doing it is in some ways exactly the wrong way, because they're undercutting Ukraine and weakening Ukraine's hand at the negotiating table when they should be doing exactly the opposite, strengthening Ukraine's hand at the negotiating table to convince Putin that he can't get any further. I would say that the deal that's on the table today has significant merit because the deal calls for a freeze in place. And I think we just have to be honest with ourselves that Ukraine is not going to reconquer Eastern Ukraine and Crimea by force. They don't have the military capability. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the warm bodies. And as a consequence, a freeze in place is probably as good a deal as we're going to get. That having been said, I think if we're going to accept a freeze in place, it has to be accompanied by a deal that ensures that the 80% of Ukraine that is still free emerges as an independent, secure, prosperous, stable democracy, able to make its own choices about its future and its geopolitical alignments. And if we can get away with that outcome, that Russia for now continues to occupy what it has, and that the rest of Ukraine emerges as a free and independent, stable, secure, defensible democracy, I would call that a success. I would not, as Trump has suggested, recognize Crimea as Russian territory. I wouldn't recognize any part of Ukraine as Russian territory. But I would simply try to end the war and then defer to a later day what happens to those parts of Ukraine currently occupied by Russian forces.
Thank you. Quick refresh. And yes. So as identity is so important, what can the world do for humans to identify more with peace and less with war?
I think that there is in human nature a bias toward confrontation and toward competition. We have this sense of us, and us is defined in part by a them. And that's just that's who we are. I think we're hardwired to think about the world in those terms. And as a consequence, I think, these moments in which peace breaks out do depend upon brave, courageous policy entrepreneurs who stick their necks out and say, hey, you know what? It doesn't have to be this way. And we see throughout history those kinds of courageous leaders. Sadat and Begin getting together amid a war-torn Middle East and negotiating peace between Israel and Egypt. Gorbachev and Reagan, right? Back in Europe, in the Monnet, Schuman, Adenauer, right? These were the kind of policy entrepreneurs, the courageous figures who went out there and said, it doesn't need to be this way, and we're going to help craft identities in which we can cooperate and live peacefully with each other and next door to each other. And, unfortunately, right now, we are living through a period of rising ethno-nationalism, of rising populism. And that's because our electorates are angry, and we're responding to that anger through, in some ways, playing to the crowd rather than trying to tame the crowd. And so I guess, the rather unsatisfying answer to your question would be, we need an American president and a Chinese president and a Russian president to say, you know what, I'm gonna start putting this competition in reverse. I'm gonna start backing away from policies that make World War III all the more likely. And it's not inconceivable to me that Trump, the transactional president, that Trump, the guy who wants the Nobel Prize, could make this kind of gambit. I'm not holding my breath, but what we need are leaders that are courageous to step up and to make those offers of unilateral accommodation that can change the momentum.
Thank you. There are several more questions. Unfortunately, in the interest of time, we're going to have to wrap it up. Professor Kupchan, I'm going to try to copy those questions and send to you. And if you have the time and you could send a couple of words, we will then forward together with your presentation to the participants. But again, we know I don't want to impose. So if you have the time, you don't have to respond now. As a good negotiator, I'm going to say sleep on it. With that, I'm going to start wrapping up. If I could ask for a round of applause to our speaker, I would really much like to express my gratitude in him accepting the invitation to be here and sharing this framework, which is so important for us nowadays. And going forward, we're going to be doing many more of these kinds of presentations and webinars with valued authors who are evidence-based, who bring really rigorous thinking for real-world problems, therefore impactful and significance, that are tangent or directly related to negotiation and conflict management, to expand our thoughts and not just stay narrow on any of these ideas. And therefore, we'll start clashing more of them and learning more as we go along as a community. Professor Charles Kupchan, once again, thank you so much on behalf of INSEAD and the whole NCMC community.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for hosting me. I enjoyed the conversation. Please, let's stay in touch.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. Will be mine as well. Thank you. I'm going to share now shameless advertising of your book so that people can buy it. And a couple more.
Be shameless.
Okay, fair. So, but you're welcome to leave because I know you're on time and you probably have to move on to your next appointment as you're starting your day over there. So with that, let me put forward here the slide. So this is the one for you. Please, by all means, everyone, feel free to pick up your phones as we did last time. And we're going to be doing in every session, we're going to be putting some QR codes for you. But Miraflor, who's today substituting YE, is also going to be putting on the chat a lot of links. So if it's easy for you to just copy them and go after them later, feel free to do that. So this is the one for Charles' book. I'm going to give a few seconds there for you to take a copy. Miraflor, if you can put things down in the chat, you already did?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Then now this is our NCMC website. So if you want to learn more about what we're doing, if you want to get recordings of previous webinars and all sorts of other materials related to this, we welcome you to do it. If I can now move on to the next one. If you want, just go to Negotiation Conflict Management Collaborative, INSEAD, and you will be able also to easily find our website. Now, these are some of the, just trying to invite you for the future ones. If you enjoyed either Professor Blattman or Professor Kupchan today, we have a lineup. Here's another QR code for you to already see all of them in a little bit more detail and register. So we would like to welcome to all of it. There's another one which we haven't updated on yet, this web card, the slide, which is Dr. Huda Abadi, who will probably come in November, talking about the application of Islamic principles in peacemaking. With that, then, let me move on to the last one and just promote a few of our projects here, a few of our outputs. So there's our most recent Harvard Business Review article here. If you would like to take a read on cross-cultural negotiations, there's something here about meditation as well. There are a couple of other things that are coming and a couple of other things that are there, but those are two that we saw people asking for. And then below, we have what NCW means is the Negotiation Course for the World, which is a project where we created a full set of negotiation materials, role play slides, teaching notes, where you can download them for free with a single click of a button. So we already have the original in English. We've already translated the whole package into Arabic. We've translated the whole thing to 130 languages, but through AI translation. They're good, but they're not yet good to go. So we are also inviting collaborators, sponsors, or anyone who would like to dedicate a little bit of time and energy to help us with this project, which has already had more than thousands, like several thousands of downloads. So it's actually doing the reach we wanted to. If you would like to proofread something on your own language and help us, even if just part of the material, or if you would like to sponsor and help us finance someone doing that, that will be, of course, extremely welcome. So please just feel free to reach out to YE or Miraflor. So Miraflor, if you could put the email of YE there and yours as well, that would be great for those who would like to get in touch. And with that, then, I would like to wrap up for today. Thank you all for coming. I hope this was fulfilling and insightful for you. And I would really I would love to look forward to seeing you either in the next webinars or in any other NCMC activity, because ultimately our goal is to build a community where we can help everyone raise their level of negotiation and conflict management and bring more value to the world and more peace to the world. Thank you so much and wishing you a wonderful day. Thank you.